and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiridoluale. The headlines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accuses Russia of energy terrorism as 4.5 million Ukrainians are now without power. Ukraine's Bakhmut region hit by fresh Russian missile strikes. And Ukrainian army fires rockets on Russian positions in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused the Kremlin of resorting to what he describes as energy terrorism as Russian troops make a few gains on the battlefield. During his daily nightly address, Mr. Zelensky said 4.5 million people were without power following Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy network. In recent weeks, Russia has carried out large-scale missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian power facilities. The strikes come as officials say Russian troops are likely to withdraw from the key southern city of Kherson. After suffering a series of painful defeats on the battlefield, Russia is said to have stepped up attacks in recent weeks on electricity infrastructure in cities away from the front lines. According to President Zelensky, in just the last month, a third of the country's power stations have been destroyed.
Тимчасово відключені за аварійними і стабілізаційними графіками близько 4,5 мільйонів споживачів.
Only as of this evening, about 4.5 million consumers have been temporarily disconnected from consumption, according to emergency and stabilization schedules, in particular in Kiev and 10 regions. Kiev region, Dnipropetrovsk region, Zhytomyr region, Zaporizhzhia region, Sumy region, Kirovohrad region, Kharkiv region, Chernihiv region, Khmelnytskyi region, and Sharsky region. Outages are also possible in other regions. Enduring Russian energy terror and passing such a test in our national task. One of the main ones now.
In the meantime, the United Nations Children's Agency, UNICEF, says it has provided 29 power generators to the Kherson region, which will help restore electricity, water, and heating to the southern area of Ukraine and benefit about 12,000 residents. The agency said 15 of the generators were delivered to ensure healthcare facilities can function in 3 communities, and an additional 14 were also delivered to local authorities to support water utilities in those areas for residents and emergency services. According to UNICEF, Ukraine representative Murat Sahin, in a news release, access to healthcare and water is a basic right, so children's access to critical services should be restored as soon as possible. UNICEF further adds that it is committed to delivering the supplies and services needed to make this happen. And U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says he believes Ukrainian forces can retake Kherson from Russian forces in perhaps his most optimistic comments on the pivotal campaign to date. Mr. Austin spoke during a news conference in Arlington, Virginia, along with his South Korean counterpart. The Defense Secretary points out that not only does he trust the capabilities of the Ukrainians to secure the disputed territory, but that most importantly, the Ukrainian military believes it can do it.
Ukrainians can take the remaining territory on the west side of the Dnieper River in Kherson. I certainly believe that they have the capability to do that. Most importantly, the Ukrainians believe that they have the capability to do that. We've seen them engage in a very methodical but effective effort to take back their sovereign territory. I think you'll see them continue to press until they secure the territory on the west side of the river. So to answer your question, I do think they have the capability.
And staying in the United States, Republican Senator Rob Portman and his Democratic colleague Chris Coons have vowed that bipartisan support would continue for Ukraine after next week's midterm congressional elections as the both traveled to Kiev. The senators told reporters that they had held very positive talks with President Volodymyr Zelensky and that they also visited an energy facility that both Coons said had been hit by a Russian strike that used an Iranian-supplied drone. The visit comes amid speculations that the Republicans, seen as favorites to take control of the House of Representatives after Thursday's midterms, could dampen U.S. support for Ukraine. The U.S. and other Western military and financial support had been absolutely vital to the Eastern European nations' fight to repel the Russian invasion.
I am confident that bipartisan, robust American support for the fight of the Ukrainian people will continue in Congress. Yes, there are questions being asked by members of both parties. We have asked questions today about making sure that the money that is being spent here for military support, for budget support, for humanitarian relief is needed. It is. It is being well spent. It is. And that we will continue to support the Ukrainian people. The United States has long been a nation that fights for freedom, and this is the most important fight for freedom in the world today. And I'm confident, given what we've heard from both Senator McConnell and Senator Schumer, that regardless of the outcome of the midterms, at least in the Senate, there will continue to be strong and bipartisan support for aid to Ukraine. And we're grateful to President Zelensky and his senior leadership team for a very positive meeting with us in which we expressed gratitude and continued support for the fight of the Ukrainian people. We visited Ukrainergo, the electricity or power company, and visited a site that was struck by Iranian-supplied drones. And we now see that Putin's goal is to make Ukraine afraid by trying to make the winter dark and cold.
Clearly, what's going on here in Ukraine is something that Republicans ought to focus on, because it's in our national security interest that Russia not succeed. Otherwise, we live in a much more dangerous and volatile world. Think of Taiwan, think of Iran in the Middle East. Think of the consequences if Vladimir Putin is allowed to succeed.
And officials from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow have met with imprisoned American basketball star Brittney Griner, vowing to continue to push for her release. Thursday's visit is the first United States consular access Ms. Griner has had since early August, when she was convicted of drug charges for bringing cannabis-infused vape cartridges into Russia and sentenced to 9 years in prison. U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price said during the meeting, U.S. officials saw Ms. Griner's tenacity and perseverance despite her present circumstances. A two-time Olympic gold medalist, Brittney Griner, is one of 2 U.S. citizens that Washington says are unjustifiably imprisoned in Russia. Paul Whelan, the other one, is a U.S. Marine veteran who was sentenced to 16 years in prison in 2020 on espionage charges. Her arrest earlier this year came days before Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and her case has moved through the Russian court system amidst frayed relations between Moscow and Washington over the war. And Moscow has summoned the British ambassador to Russia, Deborah Brunnett, over its allegations that Britain was involved in planning a Ukrainian drone attack on the Crimean port city of Sevastopol. The Russian Foreign Ministry, in a statement, gave a note of protest to the ambassador over Britain's alleged involvement in the drone strike on Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Russia has accused the UK rather, of helping Ukraine to plan Saturday's drone attack, saying it was conducted under the guidance of British Navy specialists. However, Britain denies the claim, saying Russia was peddling false claims on an epic scale. The Russian Ministry of Defense said in a statement that the démarche emphasized such. Let's talk to Victoria Siredia, a senior fellow at the Forum of Trans-Regional Studies, a senior researcher at the National Academy of Science in Ukraine, and a professor at the Ukrainian Catholic University. She joins us today from Berlin in Germany. Good morning to you, Victoria. Nice to see you again.
Morning.
Let's look at some of what we've been reporting. I'm sure you are in close touch with those back home. 40% plus of Ukraine's energy infrastructure is now confirmed as either being totally destroyed or been badly damaged, which means in large areas there isn't water, there isn't electricity. What are you hearing from those back home about how that is impacting the day-to-day activity?
So if we're talking about spirit of people, they of course still saying that we would rather live without electricity, heating, running water, but free. At the same time, we have to keep in mind that we are talking about a million or close to 1 million big cities, which are very much dependent on energy in their infrastructure. And then it might create quite soon, if there will be for a long time no running water, no heating, and colder temperature will come, will be a humanitarian catastrophe, which will mean, first of all, a new wave of people escaping from Ukraine, so new wave of displacement, and a lot of problems with critical infrastructure within those big cities. And exactly as you were naming the places, these are the biggest cities of our country. And I also witnessed this, how it works in my case. I'm teaching for the Invisible University for Ukraine. So typically I would have close to 100 students in my class. And this time I had just few because of the electricity cuts. So no internet access and no possibility to reach to them. And similarly, I'm in charge of a group of scholars. We have internet connections constantly in discussions over internet. And this is the same. They claim that they cannot connect any longer and we cannot be in touch because of electricity cuts.
Given that, but the international agencies, particularly UNICEF, as we've been reporting this morning, are trying to provide generators to be able to restore some of those utilities, particularly the water and the electricity. But perhaps, as you said, because the areas concerned are so big and the numbers of people who are involved are quite large, this response is not coming fast enough to be able to attend to all those people. But is it having an impact at all?
Yes, of course it does, very much. You have long queues of people going to wells and bringing water up to their apartments. But imagine if someone is ill, or if we have elderly people who not always are able walking for a distance and carrying water. There is a lot of help within the country, and we also observe help from outside. For example, the German universities right now reaching Ukrainian universities and helping them to buy electricity generators. So I hope within a certain period of time, which takes a little while, the situation will be a little bit better. But currently, yes, we are lucky that weather is still quite warm in Ukraine. And imagine what would be happening if there will be no heating in absolute majority of biggest cities in our country.
Let's look a little bit at the battle itself. Part of what we've been reporting this morning is that this long-anticipated battle for Kherson, which incidentally is one of the areas affected by this water and electricity outage, is likely to be retaken by Ukraine at any point in time. There's been a long preparation for this battle. The Russians have evacuated the city, have taken away most of its residents to other areas and all of that. But in terms of what it means strategically, as well as the fact that many of its citizens have been taken away, is this some kind of battle that tends to cut your nose to spite your face, if you understand what I mean? Because even if Kherson falls to the Ukrainians, most of its citizens have been taken away. Am I correct?
More or less, yes. It's not completely that way, because there is a lot of resilience on the side of Ukrainian population, and there is a lot of cautiousness on the side of Ukrainian military. Why? Because retaking a big city, if even you have a small portion of population still staying there, is very difficult and problematic, because these are our citizens. But at the same time, during almost daily, you have news about what Ukrainians are doing to combat within the occupied territories Russian troops there. So there is really extremely high resilience in this region, and it would be psychologically very problematic if those people were so courageous for such a long time, and then to say, no, we are not taking this part of the country because there is no use of it any longer or something. So it's not possible. But of course, the question is when and how, and Ukraine is very careful with its military, so they don't want just to rush them into the battle and lose a lot of people without necessity.
Now, you must be one of those who has a feeling of some level of relief, even though this was not a formal U.S. declaration. When you had those two senators come to Kiev, and the Republican one emphasized the fact that continued U.S. support for Ukraine would be robust, regardless of who wins next Tuesday's midterm elections in the United States. Before now, there had been indications that perhaps if the Republicans won, that support may be dialed back a little. And there were those who are, of course, in support of Ukraine, who were worried that the U.S. being the biggest single donor, if that support is dialed back, then the Ukrainians may have a bit of problem. So are you relieved that you're hearing from Chris Coons and Rob Portman that that may not exactly be correct?
Yes and no. First of all, I spent a longer time in US, and I remember times during the previous elections, for example, when and even before that, when Trump was winning, when Ukraine was constantly used as a political card during the election campaigns, accusing us of there was a corruption scandal and other scandals. So Ukraine was and is still, unfortunately, very much involved in internal politics. So both sides are playing different ways and pulling different strings when they are addressing Ukraine and talking about Ukraine, helping Ukraine, and so on. So we do have two levels. We have a media level, but we also have to be aware that neither Republicans nor Democrats are so unanimous within their parties. So it depends which party. For example, if Trump comes to the presidency in 2 years, what will be happening? There are different groups within Republican Party. Some of them are supporting Ukraine, and some are very cautiously resilient to that.
These are very important points that you make. Of course, we shall soon know the results of those elections by Tuesday. We'll know whether, as has been predicted, the Republicans will take the House, and if not the Senate, but President Biden will still be in the White House, at least for the next 2 years. So we'll see how all that pans out. But for now, Victoria Sireda, thank you so much for your time. Please continue to stay safe. We'll come back to talk to you sometime soon.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Fresh Russian missiles continue to strike Ukrainian cities, this time hitting the eastern city of Bakhmut amidst intense fighting. Smoke billowed from buildings in parts of the city held by Ukrainian forces, with burning houses in a residential district of the city. The streets of the city were mostly empty, apart from passing military vehicles and Ukrainian troops, as the sound of incoming mortar shelling reverberated throughout the city center. The town of Bakhmut has been the target of Russia's armed forces in its slow advance through the Donetsk region since taking the key industrial towns of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk in June and July. Britain's Ministry of Defense has said that private military company Wagner Group likely remains heavily involved in the Bakhmut fighting. And Russia is aiming to resume traffic by late December in both lanes of the Crimean bridge that was severely damaged by an explosion last month. According to Russian Deputy Prime Minister Marat Kushnin, Moscow plans to launch traffic on both lanes on the right side of the bridge on December the 5th on one lane and on December the 20th on the other. Mr. Kushunin said this during a televised meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin and other members of the government during a Thursday, where President Putin had thanked everyone involved in the restoration of the bridge. Early last month, an explosion severely damaged the structure connecting annexed Crimea to the Russian mainland, causing parts of Europe's longest bridge to collapse. Moscow swiftly blamed Ukrainian special forces for carrying out the attack, though Kiev has not taken credit. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has welcomed the revival of the Black Sea grain corridor this week, saying the ships departing Ukrainian ports provide hopeful news in a world churning in turmoil. 7 vessels carrying food left Ukraine's ports today after Russia agreed to rejoin the Black Sea grain deal. Shipments of grain from Ukraine had been in jeopardy after Russia suspended its participation in the initiative last weekend. It resumed the role on Wednesday.
I come today bearing a measure of good news, hopeful news in a world churning in turmoil. It has been said that one might not always appreciate something until it is at risk or gone altogether. Over the past few days, I believe the world has come to understand and appreciate the importance of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. I'm pleased to announce that today the initiative has hit a new milestone. As of today, 10 million metric tons of grain and other foodstuffs have been shipped through the Black Sea corridor. It has taken just 3 months to reach this milestone. Despite all the obstacles we have seen, the beacon of hope in the Black Sea is still shining and the initiative is working. Now that the initiative has fully resumed, I appeal to all parties to concentrate efforts in 2 areas. First, to renewal and full implementation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Second, to removing the remaining obstacles to the exports of Russian food and fertilizer.
Turkey's foreign minister says that Sweden and Finland have not yet fulfilled all obligations under a deal clearing the bids to join NATO and that they must still take concrete steps to do so. Mevlut Cavusoglu, speaking alongside NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in Istanbul, also said Turkey observed that Sweden's new government under new Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson is taking a decisive approach to fulfilling the obligations. On NATO's part, Secretary General Stoltenberg says in these dangerous times, it is even more important to finalize their accession to prevent any misunderstanding or miscalculation in Moscow.
The problem on Black Sea grain export is resolved with our efforts under the leadership of our president. But in 20 days, the grain deal needs to be renewed. It was a 4-month agreement. Our effort to renew it will continue under the leadership of our president.
It's time to welcome Finland and Sweden as full members of NATO. Their accession will make our alliance stronger and our people safer. In these dangerous times, it is even more important to finalize their accession, to prevent any misunderstanding or miscalculation in Moscow, and to send a clear message to Russia that NATO's door remains open.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky might not be part of the upcoming G20 taking place in Bali, Indonesia. Mr. Zelensky said he would not take part in the summit that brings together the group of 20 major economies if Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin attends. He made this known after talks in Kiev with Greece's president that he had been invited to participate in the November 15 summit by Indonesian President Joko Widodo. But it's unclear if Russian President Vladimir Putin will be attending. Earlier in the week, the Kremlin said Mr. Putin had discussed the summit with President Widodo in a phone call, but did not mention whether he planned to attend or not. All right, let's talk to Laddie Williams as we unveil some of the business happenings here. The EU, hi Laddie. The EU is studying the feasibility of using billions of euros worth of Russian central bank assets already frozen by member states to help with Ukraine's reconstruction. Wouldn't that be illegal?
Yeah, most people feel, that this would actually be, illegal, because these countries, entrusted these monies with you, hoping that when they need it, they can get it, even though they are, in good terms
or not.
But apparently they're exploring this, and it remains to be seen if the U.S. would actually, buy this. And by the end of the day, we know Russia had about over $600 billion, in foreign reserve before the war, before they invaded Ukraine. But half of that, has been taken out, because they have most of that, in other countries.
Yes, in other countries.
So all of that money is at risk, right now, if they actually go through with this. But, some analysts are saying that if the U.S. actually, joins this, it will be it could give a bad signal to other central bankers. They might not want to keep their funds
there anymore, because if we're not in good terms, you will feel free to seize
just seize my money. So it has to be really weighed. But at the end of the day, they're saying that it's estimated about $750 billion will be needed to rebuild Ukraine. But at the end of the day, where's that money going to come from? So that's why they're trying to explore,
all these options.
But it's not a
done deal yet.
It's not a done deal.
Good one. Now, the Bank of England has followed the Fed in the U.S. 75 basis points.
Match for match.
But the impact of this is slightly different, isn't it?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, the market's already priced all of this in, and we saw the 75 basis points. It was expected. But the main blow, that we got yesterday was the Bank of England actually warning that the UK will be going into the longest recession in history. And, the R word has been going around for a while now, because we've seen the way central bankers have been consistently raising rates, trying to tame inflation. But at the end of the day, we're not seeing the effect yet, on inflation. And, some experts say it takes about, 18 months to feel the impact of the first, hike.
Right.
So we might need to wait, a little longer to see, inflation, start to peak or, start to come down, at some point. But the central bankers have said they will keep raising rates as long as inflation keeps going up. And remember, if we go back to when the pandemic, when we're in the pandemic, experts were warning, central bankers about the stimulus packages that
they were unleashing on the world, mostly with borrowed funds.
Exactly, and we're seeing it happen now. And, central bankers now are scampering to see how they can, mop up all that liquidity. But at the end of the day, it's a tough choice, the central bankers have to make, at this point. Fight inflation at the risk of a recession, and they are seeing a recession coming. And that's why I'm going to be discussing, later, investing in a tightening cycle.
In a tightening cycle, absolutely. Because there'll be a lot of people will be wondering how
where do I put my money
that safely and profitably.
Yes, exactly.
How are the markets? I know you've mentioned the fact that the markets seem to have priced this in.
Yes.
So maybe the reactions are not as volatile as we would have been expecting.
Because I checked the markets this morning, they're green, even though the U.S. closed yesterday in the red, because, the markets are still weighing, some of the rate hikes. But this morning, I saw the U.S. futures already tending upward. They're still expecting the jobs report. That's coming out today. So if it comes out, good, the investors are already expecting that it would be, good. And we're seeing the other markets actually in the green, too. In Europe, we're seeing the FTSE in the green. We're seeing Bitcoin also holding up, strong. So it's looking like, Friday might end up in the green. But we know how these markets are. It could start looking green now, then
end completely different.
Some information comes out, and
that will be the end of that.
Exactly.
Indeed, Ladi, thanks for that. As you heard Ladi say, there will be more to unpack on all of this. I'm particularly interested in that, how to invest safely in a recession circle, and I know that a lot of people will be interested in that, so we'll look out for that. But for now, thanks, Ladi.
Thank you.
NATO says Iran is considering supplying Russia with ballistic missiles for its war in Ukraine, in addition to the drones Tehran has already delivered. That's according to Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who was speaking at a news conference in Istanbul, Iran, is offering drones and considering ballistic missile deliveries to Russia. He adds that this is unacceptable. No country should provide support to Moscow in this war. Two senior Iranian officials and two Iranian diplomats are said to have promised to provide Russia with surface-to-surface missiles in addition to more drones, a move that is likely to infuriate the United States and other Western powers. A deal was agreed on October 6 when Iran's first Vice President Mohammad Mokbar, two senior officials from Iran's powerful Revolutionary Guards, and an official from the Supreme National Security Council visited Moscow for talks with Russia about the delivery of the weapons.
We also see Iran offering drones and considering ballistic missile deliveries to Russia. This is unacceptable. No country should provide support to Moscow in this illegal war. President Putin is failing in Ukraine, but he is responding with more brutality. In recent weeks, we have seen dozens of drone and missile strikes across Ukraine, including on critical infrastructure, cruelly and deliberately depriving Ukrainian civilians of heating, water and electricity at the outset of winter. Cooperation with Turkey to counter terrorism.
Let's talk now to Ambassador Frank Isso, Nigeria's former envoy in Ukraine. He joins us from our Abuja studios. Your Excellency, good morning. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, good morning, Ladi. Pleasure to be here.
Let me start off with what we've just reported. The Iranians supplying the Russians with missiles, apart from the drones that have been alleged in the past. Someone who is looking at this conflict, you know, without any bias on any side would say, well, the U.S. is supporting Ukraine and NATO is supporting Ukraine, the EU is supporting Ukraine. Why should Russia's friends not support Russia with weapons?
Well, that's very tricky there. The fact is that Iran is under sanctions by the United Nations and really shouldn't be seen, you know, cavorting as it were with other countries. Every country is bound, you know, to respect the UN resolution, you know, on these sanctions against Iran. But then it doesn't appear as if that can stop Iran. Iran has been a pariah state for quite some time, and if this is just a slight opening to increase her visibility on the international scene, I think she will rally around and take that up. I think that's exactly what she's doing. And she's not the only one, you know, doing that. I think North Korea is there to, you know, supply artillery shells, you know, to Putin. What it underscores, you know, is that Russia is really having difficulties, you know, producing its own armaments. And that's as a result of the crippling sanctions from the West. It's beginning to tell seriously, you know, on Russia. But Iran is going to continue this kind of game, you know, until some serious efforts are made by the West to curtail it.
Now, for many people, the role that Turkey, because when you talk about visibility on the international stage, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Turkey itself was in the spotlight for a lot of wrong reasons, shall we say. And then now suddenly Turkey seems to be the bride of everybody. The Ukrainians are talking to them. The Russians are talking to them. NATO, of course, they are a member of NATO. The United States is having to talk to them. And they seem to be instrumental to the deals that have so far been reached. Even though none of the deals is a peace deal to stop the conflict. But the deals that have been reached, Turkey has been instrumental to it. How did President Erdogan go from this, shall I say, pariah status to being, you know, the man at the center of all the initiatives?
Well, I should look at it from the point of the dynamism of Turkey's foreign policy. Being able to move, you know, like you said, from being a quasi-pariah state, you know, to a state that everybody is now seeking to be friends with. It shows, you know, that Turkey can really re-engineer herself, you know, when the time matters. What is happening now, you know, that is trying to be a bridge builder between the East and the West. And everybody knows that Turkey is needed. And you are aware of Turkey's long-standing problems with Greece. So if it can play this kind of conciliatory role in the Ukrainian war, the hope is there, that she can equally be talked to scale down its problem with Greece. So if it continues this way, I'd see her being accepted more and more, by the West. Even though she's a member of NATO, she has really not been truly accepted, by the West. I think the issue has to do with culture clash, between the two sides. But from what she's been doing so far, ensuring that this grain deal, continues, and hopefully we'll see that it is renewed, sometime later this month. It's something I hope for which the world should be looking up to.
Why do you think the Russians returned to that deal? They had said they had suspended their participation, and then, of course, some had interpreted that to mean they were pulling out, and then they clarified to say they weren't actually pulling out, they were suspending their participation. And then before they then said, well, we are willing to continue, and that was after President Erdogan stepped in. Was there some kind of diplomatic advantage to first pulling out or seeming to pull out and then now returning to the deal? Was there any advantage to the Russians from this?
From my own perspective, I think Russia was rather too hasty in pulling out. And after doing that now, she discovered that she needed some leeway to come back in. And I'll give you the reason why I think so. You recall that after the deal was signed in July, within a few days, the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, took a swing through Africa. He visited, I think, Congo Republic, Ethiopia, and Uganda, if I recall correctly.
Yes.
And he was busy there telling them that Russia's concern for Africa was the reason why it reached that deal with Ukraine, so that Africa, would have its food problem resolved. He played that up. And for a continent that has seemingly been very supportive of Russia, not in the sense of supporting UN resolutions in Russia, but abstaining from voting, which Russia could consider some victory. Now, to scuttle the deal as it were now, that will create some problems with her, with Africa. In a world where she lacks friends in Europe, in the Americas, and to a very large degree in Asia, I don't think she could afford, to lose the friendship she has remaining in Africa. I think that could have been a spoil, in trying to come back, to the deal.
Let's now look at the battlefront itself, Ambassador, and it does look as if, as you predicted much earlier on, once the Ukrainians were not defeated within the first few days or weeks, as many expected, perhaps including the Russians, then it was going to devolve into this grinding, slow situation, which is what we have seen almost 9 months now into the war. A few gains here from the Russians, a few gains here from the Ukrainians. But in terms of any kind of decisive military victory, it's not happening. It does appear as if the diplomatic initiatives have been put aside. Even though nobody is winning, nobody is also talking about ending this. Would you say, therefore, that the United Nations perhaps has found itself on the back foot on this one, and it's been exposed as sort of a toothless institution?
Well, it has always been difficult for the UN to act without a concert of agreement, between the 5 powers in the Security Council. And now that one of them is the culprit, as it were, Russia, the UN can never effectively reach a decision to end the war. So the way things stand now, I don't see the UN playing any serious role in trying to bring about peace. And then I do not even think there exists currently a basis for peace negotiation. You can't occupy another country's territory in flagrant violation of extant UN laws and regulations. Then you decide to sit down and hold peace discussions, with the country affected. It's not going to happen. It's only a situation where Russia agrees to withdraw to pre-war borders, then negotiations can start. And that negotiation will center essentially on what the interest of Russia will be in those two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, that have been clamoring, to be excised, from Ukraine. So until that is done, I don't see any peaceful negotiation taking place. Now, the war will continue grinding on, and I did say this, much earlier. It's not going to be easy for Russia to overrun Ukraine. Ukraine is a fairly large country, and the places Russia operates now are mainly ethnic Russian-speaking territories of Ukraine. So we can say, that she gets some support, from the civilian population. But outside those areas, it will come across a very hostile population. And again, too, the Russians lack motivation. The average Russian soldier lacks motivation. They can't sustain this war for much longer. Even these reserves they've called up now, after a while, as body bags start arriving in Moscow, it's going to be a problem for the society and for the regime. Because the Ukrainians have that resolve. They are fighting for their country, and nothing can stop them until total victory is achieved. That's the way I look at it.
A grim prediction, Ambassador. So, but I want to thank you for that perspective this morning and for your time. We will, of course, return to you at an appropriate time in the future. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back. Ukraine says it trusts Elon Musk to continue providing internet access through his SpaceX rocket company's Starlink satellite system in spite of a wobble last month, but is also seeking additional providers. Mikhailo Fedorov, one of Ukraine's deputy prime ministers, and was in Portugal where he was speaking and attending Europe's largest tech conference, the Lisbon Web Summit. Mr. Fedorov says Ukraine had discussed Starlink directly with Mr. Musk, the world's richest man, and was confident the Tesla and Twitter boss would not shut the service down in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Microsoft's president, Brad Smith, says the company will be extending all the technological aid it has been providing to the government and other businesses in Ukraine throughout the year 2023.
I'm here to announce that we at Microsoft are going to extend throughout all of 2023 all of the technology aid that we have been providing to the government and the critical infrastructure and the other businesses in Ukraine that we initiated in February. In effect, it amounts to a commitment of approximately an additional $100 million of technology aid from Microsoft to the government and the people of Ukraine.
5 minutes, so we'll see you there. Thank you to all the speakers.
Members of Ukraine's National Guard in Kharkiv have been working to repair combat vehicles towed away from the front line, including the ones captured from or abandoned by Russian troops. Ukraine's National Guard said tanks, IFV, that's infantry fighting vehicles, and APCs, armored personnel carriers left behind by Russian forces, are helping Ukrainian troops to increase their firepower and carry out counter-offensives on all fronts. The commander of the repair brigade, Alexander Bohaterov, says the troops repair combat vehicles, which he calls trophies. According to the British Ministry of Defense, Russia lost over 40 armored vehicles a day, equivalent to a battalion's worth of equipment, as Ukrainian forces continued their counter-offensives in the east and south of the country. Finally, on the program, freedom for 107 Ukrainian soldiers released in a prisoner swap with Russia. The head of the Ukrainian president's office, Andriy Yermak, said 74 Mariupol defenders are amongst the freed, adding that some had sustained injuries in March. One of the soldiers was wounded as a result of an explosion at the Olenivka camp, according to Mr. Yermak. More than 50 Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed in the attack at that camp in July, many of them soldiers who had defended the Azovstal steel mill in Mariupol before giving themselves up. Ukraine accused Russia of blowing up a barracks to cover up what they said was torture. That's the program. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akeredoluale. There'll be updates as we do have them all throughout the day, but particularly on the World Today at 5 o'clock. To have yourselves a pleasant day and weekend ahead. Good morning.